Nice to see you again. It is Filling in the History yet again. I am the amateur historian. Today we're going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants sections 41 through 44. And inside of this is going to be kind of a long one, I assume, because we are talking about another enormously important section of the Doctrine and Covenants that is still used to this day. So you have the Articles and Covenants, which is section 20. And then you also have section 42, which is the law. So the Articles and Covenants and the law sort of combine together, and that is the basis to this day of how the church operates. So going to jump right into it. We're even going to get some, at the time anyway, anti-Mormon interpretation of what some of these sections mean, which I actually kind of get a kick out of. So starting in right now with section 41. The earliest version of this is from Revelation Book 1. It is called the 44th Commandment, and we get some grammatical changes to this document, as you can see. We do get a few additions to the Revelations. So a couple of grammatical things, and what I get a kick out of that I've never mentioned before is that all of the things like you may see here in these images, like the triple line underneath the letter still means capitalize. I didn't realize that like a lot of these, like a caret to insert and just all these kind of symbols that we've been using to annotate documents have been going on for a very long time. So I don't know, little dweeby thing there, but I think that's kind of interesting. But we do have some additions to this revelation. So we get this one, which is when I come and behold, I come quickly, is actually an addition made in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. And then another one we have, given to them that are not worthy, or to dogs, or pearls before swine is what the rest of it is. That one was added by John Whitmer. It used to just say, children of the kingdom should be cast before swine, and that was it. So there was an addition of, dogs and people who are not worthy and all this kind of stuff. So, and what used to say, it is meet that my servant Sidney should have a comfortable room to live in, was changed to, by John Whitmer's hand, to as seemeth him good. In this section, what happens is that Joseph is the commandment kind of says like, look, Joseph needs a place to translate. This is the Bible still. We're talking about translating the Bible. Revising the Bible probably is a better way of saying it. And to do his work, he was they were kind of commanded to kind of build him a house, which was actually not really uncommon. This was a lot of religious societies would build homes for each other back in this time. And then apparently Sidney didn't get one, which is fine. We'll actually get to a very interesting thing his son mentions later on about sort of Sidney's position before he became a Latter-day Saint. So anyway, this section also is found in Revelation Book 2, handwriting of Frederick G. Williams. There are no corrections on that one, but this is one of two sections that we get that actually exist in both Revelation Book 1 and 2. So 44th Commandment here. It is chapter 43 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 1 in the original Doctrine and Covenants. So, getting into John Whitmer's history, which becomes a lot more prevalent here. And again, this is from Histories Volume 2, is where we get a lot of the extra footnotes and the historical introductions and things for that. We do get, it is included as the first revelation of his second chapter. So John Whitmer's story moves on. Chapter 1 is over now, and we move on to chapter 2, and this is the first thing you get. Before we get into that, though, there are some significant changes to the section headings between 1981 and 2013. And so I didn't know how to do this succinctly, so I'm just going to read them off. So if you had a 1981 version of the Doctrine and Covenants, it would have said, revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet to the church at Kirtland, Ohio, February 4th, 1831. And this is from History of the Church, Volume 1, pages 146 and 144. 146 and 147. Wow, can't read. Anyway, the Kirtland branch of the church at this time was rapidly increasing in numbers. Prefacing this revelation, the prophet wrote, the members were striving to do the will of God as far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. And the Lord gave unto the church the following. That's 1981. In 2013, when the section headings were redone, This was one of the major changes. So now we get revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet to the church at Kirtland, Ohio, February 4, 1831. This revelation instructs the prophet and church elders to pray to receive God's law. See section 42. And that's going to be the big one today. Joseph Smith had just arrived in Kirtland from New York, and Lehman Copley, a church member in nearby Thompson, Ohio, requested Brother Joseph and Sidney Rigdon live with him, and he would furnish them houses and provisions. The following revelation clarifies where Joseph and Sidney should live, and also calls Edward Partridge to be the church's first bishop. So that's a big change between the two. Again, some people said that the church changed their scriptures in 2013. If you want to call section headings changes to scriptures, sure, but the actual content of it remained the same. In fact, one thing that was interesting, I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous episode, but in the document that the church put out, there's a whole essay that the church put out about changing scriptural references based on what they've learned from the Joseph Smith papers. They actually wanted to keep the format the same so the pages look the same. So they didn't really make humongous changes even to the, in terms of spacing anyway, to the section headings. So they really try to keep the format the same as far as how it looked. So not a whole lot of changes there, especially not to the actual content of the revelations. These section headings are more of an explanation. So just as a footnote, I don't know if I've mentioned that before. So that's a bit about the papers. So circumstantial introduction to section 41. Revelation book 1 gives 44th commandment given February 4th, 1831 at Kirtland, Geauga County, Ohio, given to the church in these parts. It pointed at the office of Edward Partridge, etc. And there was a man by the name of Copley, who was Lehman Copley, in the township of Thompson, who had requested his brother Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon to live with him, and he would furnish them houses and provisions, etc. Then by Joseph inquired of the Lord and received as follows. Revelation book 2 is a little different, a lot more concise. It says commandment given February 4th, 1831 to choose a bishop, etc. So this is the first time that a bishop is mentioned as an office in the church. And this would be the closest equivalent today would be what we would now call the presiding bishop. So if you're not aware, there's the president of the church has 2 counselors. That is the first presidency, highest office in the church. Underneath that, you have 12 apostles, and these 15 people, including the first presidency, hold keys of the priesthood. Like that's where the keys come from, and they are the authorities of the church. Then it's kind of interesting. The temporal affairs of the church are actually handed over to another presidency, or bishopric in this case, where you actually have a presiding bishop who has 2 counselors, and they handle all of the temporal affairs of the church, just like Edward Partridge was at this time. Now, from a local level, there's bishops at every single ward level. So if you live in a ward, which is an organization of the church, you're going to have a bishop, and his job as well is going to be temporal affairs mostly, taking care of people in the ward and making sure they're okay. So that is the first time this is ever mentioned, is section 41. So I find it interesting that Revelation book 2 says this is about calling a bishop, whereas as you can see with the other introductions we've had, it's like maybe you mention it, maybe you don't. The Book of Commandments gives us this. It says a revelation to the church in Kirtland, Ohio, and also the calling of Edward to the office of bishop, given February 1831. So some of the brief introductions there. The Whitmer history gives us a little more, and I'll just start this again. It starts in chapter 2. So here we go, chapter 2. About these days, Joseph the prophet and Sidney Rigdon arrived at Kirtland to the joy and satisfaction of the saints. The disciples had all things common and were going to destruction very fast as to temporal things. For they considered from reading the scripture that what belonged to one man, a brother, belonged to any of the brethren. Therefore they would take each other's clothes and other property and use it without leave, and brought on confusion and disappointments, for they did not understand the scripture. After Joseph lived here a few days, the word of the Lord came, saying. So they got really zealous about this and just started kind of taking stuff. And everybody was like, you can't just take my stuff. Anyway, so it was a whole mess. So that's what section 41 is all about, is Joseph clarifying what all this means. And so thank you, John, for a very, very good introduction to this. And he also just lists out the revelation after that. The manuscript history gives us, again, a very kind of similar, but maybe a little bit more positive take than John Whitmer does. And it says, the branch of the church in this part of the Lord's vineyard, which had increased to nearly 100 members, were striving to do the will of God as far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. With a little caution and some wisdom, I soon assisted the brethren and sisters to overcome them. The plan of common stock, which had existed in what was called the family, whose members generally had embraced the everlasting gospel, was readily abandoned for the more perfect law of the Lord, and the false spirits were easily discerned and rejected by the light of revelation. 4th February 1831, Friday, the Lord gave unto the church the following revelation at Kirtland, Ohio. Again, February 4, 1831. And so, what we get from this is there was a clarification. There was about 100 people living what was called the family law. So in Kirtland, there was a family, we've mentioned this before, that were really trying to separate themselves from the world, sort of homestead on their own and just trade with each other. And then everything was just free for all. Like there was no rules behind it. And those converts that joined the church and then Sydney left to go to New York started trying to do the same thing all over again, which makes a lot of sense. Joseph came and sort of clarified that. And then you get this revelation, which is pretty cool. So Documents Volume 1 gives us a historical introduction. Says this revelation was dictated the same day Joseph Smith arrived in Kirtland, Ohio, from New York. According to John Whitmer's headnote, inscribed a few months later in spring of 1831, the revelation was a response to Joseph Smith's prayer regarding an offer made by new convert Lehman Copley to provide Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon houses and provisions on his farm in Thompson Township, Ohio, about 20 miles east of Kirtland. Joseph Smith and his family were in need of housing because of their recent move, and Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon had lost a house apparently being built for them by his former Campbellite congregation in nearby Mentor, Ohio, when he converted to the Church of Christ. Early published versions of this revelation did not include Whitmer's headnote, and in later histories, neither Joseph Smith nor Whitmer connected Copley's offer to this revelation. Both histories instead place the revelation in the context of concerns about religious excesses among the new church members in Ohio. The revelation, however, does not explicitly address this matter. So the things that John Whitmer was talking about. So what about this Thompson offer? This becomes a very significant thing later in the history. We'll get to that at a later day. It says, from the historical introduction, the revelation instructed church members that Joseph Smith should have a house built in which to live and translate, and that Sidney Rigdon should have a comfortable room to live in. Though silent about Copley's offer of assistance, Joseph Smith's history explained that upon their arrival in Kirtland, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith were kindly received and welcomed into the house of Brother Newell K. Whitney. The history continues, I and my wife lived in the family of Brother Whitney several weeks and received every kindness and attention, which could be expected, and especially from Sister Elizabeth Ann Whitney. Although neither Joseph Smith nor Sidney Rigdon accepted Copley's offer to live in Thompson, Copley made a similar offer a few months later to the group of church members migrating to Ohio from Colesville, New York. So that's the Thompson offer, as I call it. You know, where do you want to live? Do you want to come live with us or not? And this would explain why there's a lot of talk about, Joseph needs a place. Joseph and his family need a place to do their thing. And then we get to the office of the bishop. John Whitmer's headnote in Revelation Book 1 listed another purpose for this revelation, pointing at the office of Edward Partridge, who the revelation commanded to be ordained as the church's first bishop. This is the first extant document that uses bishop as an office of the church. And there you have it. Who's Edward Partridge again? I think we've gone over this before, but Partridge, again, was a hatter and a convert. He was formerly in the Shaker Society. That was his religion. Who met Joseph a few months previous, was baptized 2 days after meeting Joseph, and then served a mission based on a revelation he received from Joseph. We get this from the historical introduction. Partridge spent the next month and a half sharing his new faith with relatives and friends in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, an effort that his daughter Emily later characterized as unsuccessful. He returned to New York from Massachusetts in time to join Joseph Smith, Emmett, and Sidney Rigdon in their move to Ohio during the last week of January 1831. So, months in, and this guy has served a mission. He is now moving to Ohio and now called as the bishop of the church, dealing with property and taking care of the poor. So, again, just to reiterate, like, the church has not been around for a year yet. Okay, and our numbers are very small. You're talking about a maximum of maybe 100 people that are in the Kirtland area, at least, by the time Joseph arrives. And so we're not talking about an enormous crowd. Big enough, though, I think, for a very early on church. But Edward Partridge was one of those that was asked to do quite a lot, and seemingly he went for it. I mean, there's a lot of notes that we'll get to in a moment here about that. So a little bit about the content and some of the footnotes from this revelation. The revelation itself has this statement in it: "Behold, I give unto you a commandment, that you shall assemble yourselves together to agree upon my word, and by the prayer of your faith you shall receive my law, that you may know how to govern my church." Footnote 4 from this clarifies. It says, "The 2nd of January, 1831 revelation directing the members in New York to remove to Ohio had promised the reception of, quote, my law in Ohio." The first part of a revelation titled in Revelation Book 1, "The Laws of the Church of Christ," was received 5 days after this 4th of February revelation. So kind of fun that they were able to kind of combine their faith, and they said, we really want this law. We've moved to Ohio. And then, yeah, like right away, 5 days later, you get it. The revelation also says, quote, "It is meet that my servant Joseph should have a house built in which to live and translate." And footnote 6 about this says, "Rather than accepting Copley's apparent offer, to live in Thompson, Joseph Smith stayed in the Kirtland area. After their initial stay with the family of Newell K. Whitney, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith moved into a small frame home on the property of Isaac Morley, another land-owning Ohio convert." As a side note to this, kind of a personal note to this, my wife and I actually went to the Manti, Utah temple, and Isaac Morley, part of his temple clothing that he had is actually framed in that building. So Isaac Morley was a very major figure in the early church history. And you can see, if you ever go to the Manti temple, it's sort of an artifact from his life, which is kind of fun. We're talking about moving to Ohio. And I believe we've already spoken to the fact that, you get a bunch of people selling property all at once, and the market forces are going to drive the prices down. Well, how far did they get driven down? I found this footnote 8 about Edward Partridge and his properties. This was not a poor man. He owned land. He was I think haberdasher is the term, but he was a hatter. He owned a hat shop in the area. So he had a business, he had land, he was in good shape. So footnote 8 was very revealing to me. And it says this: "Partridge owned a hat shop near the town square in Painesville, Ohio." There it is again. "And a few miles from Kirtland, as well as multiple pieces of property in the area." Partridge's daughter later recalled that after this revelation was dictated, her father sold his property and, quote, realized but little from the transactions. She added, "My father's course in joining the Mormon religion and sacrificing his property caused his friends of the world to think him insane. They could not see what there was in religion to make a man give up all worldly considerations for it. Partridge's willingness to part with both his business and property in the area, however, predated his affiliation with the Church of Christ. On the 8th of September, 1829, the Painesville Telegraph carried a notice of Partridge's intent to liquidate all of his Ohio assets. Quote, "Wishing to quit the hatting business and leave Painesville, I now offer my land for sale, together with an assortment of stock, trimmings, and tools. My shop is large and commodious, and is pleasantly situated on Main Street near the public square, and is the only hat shop in town. On the lot with the shop is a convenient dwelling house, barn, and an excellent well of water." unquote. Partridge also offered for sale other large parcels of land, including a farm lying on the south part of Harpersville containing 100 acres. And further to this, the hat shop was still open for business in November of 1831, so months later. And while his 100-acre farm near Harpersville, Ohio had been sold, Partridge received only one horse with accompanying bridle and saddle as payment. Some of Partridge's land remained unsold until March of 1832. So we're in February of 1832. So the fact that or 1831, excuse me, February of 1831, a lot of stuff doesn't get sold until the end of the year or the following year. And for a 100-acre farm, he got a horse and a bridle. And that's just to kind of give you a sense of how much loss at least one person incurred. So the aftermath of this, a few days later, in the presence of 12 elders, we are told, we get, quote, the law that was promised for the believers that moved to the Ohio. So let's get into the law. This is going to be a little lengthy, I perceive. This is an introduction to Doctrine and Covenants. Now, section 42 is where we are. The earliest version that we have is, quote, part of a notebook of at least 16 leaves, likely created by Sidman's writer, unquote. Now, we'll get into what that all means in a moment, but we are not starting with the Revelation Book 1. But this is, I won't say probably, to this point, the most well-documented revelation that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants. So leading up to this point, there are copies of this thing flying all over the place, and they're everywhere. In this particular case, we get it from just a notebook of about 16 leaves of independent paper, by the way. Source note for this: of the many extant versions of this text, the writer manuscript is likely the earliest, save the incomplete version found in Revelation Book 1. According to a letter filed with this manuscript, this document, with several other manuscript revelations, was donated to the church historian's office in the early 1960s by a descendant of Sidman's writer. The rolled-up papers were discovered by the writer family in 1958, having presumably been held by the family since writer obtained them circa 1831. Further to this, running along the left edge of each recto are 8 small holes likely used for sewing the booklet together. Based on comparison of the cuts and tears of these pages, along with copies of Articles and Covenants circa April 1830, what we now call Doctrine and Covenants section 20, and Revelation, 23rd of February of 1831, which is sections 42 but 74 through 93, so we'll get to that in a second, kind of the second part of it, were part of a notebook of at least 16 leaves, likely created by Sidman's writer. It is unknown when these pages were removed from the notebook. So something that, if you ever do read the Joseph Smith papers, they're going to talk a lot about verso and recto. And here's a picture of what that means. Verso is the page on the left, recto is the one on the right. So when you're looking at a piece of paper, they talk a lot in this, and if you're talking about any documentary history, you're going to be talking a lot about verso and recto. This is a kind of like a printing and a paperwork term that is not used a whole lot, but if you're wondering what that means, you can just kind of see here the verso would be that I guess the bound edge is on the right side, and recto with the bound edge would be on the left side, and it's kind of first and last, more or less. Anyway, so that's that. Why did they do this? Why is Sidman's writer the guy here? So Sidman's writer likely supplied a copy of this revelation to the Western Courier in Ravenna, Ohio, which first published it in the 1st of September, 1831 edition. So that's the actual original copy. Revelation Book 1 is a less complete copy. So Revelation Book 1, there's 2 parts to this. The first one that you get is called the Laws of the Church of Christ. There are some grammar changes and verse numbering that happens in the hand of W. W. Phelps. There is a major difference here that was never published that you may have noticed by now, and it is that Section 42 was originally a question and answer format of this document. Okay, so that means that there would be a question, and then they would answer the question. And that went on. There was 5 questions, and that is what they would use. Now, in Revelation Book 1, those are all scratched out in the hand of Oliver Cowdery. So, and we just know that from the history mostly and some forensic evidence. But it's, yeah, you get verses 1 through 73 as we have it today, is this first revelation. There's also a scrap of paper adhered to it that contains more verses of it. It is written in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery. It is adhered to what is called page 67 in Revelation Book 1. And so there's kind of 2 parts to this. And even then, you don't have the entire section 42. And so that's where we come to Sidman's Writer. He has the most complete version of this that was published in our Doctrine and Covenants as we have it today. The Book of Commandments used what was here. And so the Book of Commandments also does not have a complete copy of, as we have it today, of the law of section 42. On that note, though, chapter 44 and 46 in the Book of Commandments, those are both called Revelations. And if you were to combine chapters 44 and 46, you would have today what is called section 42. All of it is put together, finally, in section 8 of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. In both cases, these are called a revelation, but as you saw in the Revelation Book 1, it is called the Laws of the Church of Christ. So we are departing a little bit again. This is not called a commandment or anything else. It's not numbered. That's what we have here. So there's section heading changes that clarify that there are 2 parts. So not quite as dramatic as section 41, but the 1981 version of this says, Revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet at Kirtland, Ohio, February 9th, 1831, which is History of the Church 148 and 154 through 154. It was received in the presence of 12 elders and in fulfillment of the Lord's promise previously made that the law would be given in Ohio. See section 38.2. The prophet specifies this revelation as embracing the law of the church. The 2013 edition of this is a little different. It says, Revelation given in 2 parts through Joseph Smith the prophet at Kirtland, Ohio, February 9th and 23rd, 1831. The first part, consisting of verses 1 through 72, was received in the presence of 12 elders and in fulfillment of the Lord's promise previously made that the law would be given in Ohio. See section 38.2. The second portion consists of verses 73 through 93. The prophet specifies this revelation as, quote, embracing the law of the church, unquote. So a lot of introductions here. Circumstantial introductions get a little fun because we even get one from an anti-Mormon source, which I think is kind of fun. So we're going to go into that too. So the earliest version that we possibly get, which is Writer's Papers, says, quote, the laws of the Church of Christ, Kirtland, Geauga, Ohio, May 23rd, 1831, a commandment to the elders. Revelation Book 1 gives us the laws of the Church of Christ received in Kirtland, Geauga County, state of Ohio, in the presence of 12 elders, February 9th, 1831. The next one, and I just couldn't stand it. The next one that we get is from Mormonism Unveiled. So this is not a positive tract. This is a book which was more or less anti-Mormon and sort of revealing the evils of the Latter-day Saint movement, according to them. It says this, their common stock principles appear to be somewhat similar to those of the Shakers. And just side note, that is where Edward Partridge came from, so it makes sense. Each one, however, is allowed to manage his own affairs in his own way until he arrives in Missouri. There the bishop resides. He has supreme command in all pecuniary matters, according to the revelations given by the prophet. The one relating to this branch of business reads in these words, if thou lovest me, thou shalt serve me and keep my commandments, and behold, thou shalt consecrate all thy properties, that which thou hast, unto me, with a covenant and a deed, etc., and so forth. So that's maybe a little, and again, I actually don't think that's that negative. I think they're just kind of putting their own slant on it, but I think they're actually pretty accurate. So anyway, but the Mormonism Unveiled is not a friendly publication to the church. Okay. Painesville Telegraph strikes again, and it doesn't say much about it. It just entitles it Secret Bylaws of the Mormonites. So if you're wondering what our secret bylaws, or maybe even what Mormonites are, read section 42. That's from the Painesville Telegraph. John Whitmer's history gives this introduction. It says, "Behold, after this revelation was received, the elders were called together and united in mighty prayer, and were agreed as touching the reception of the law. Therefore, thus saith the Lord." And section 42 comes. It's actually kind of brief. And I feel like John's kind of merging it with section 41, which makes a lot of sense. The manuscript history gives us this, quote, "On the 9th of February, 1831, at Kirtland, in the presence of 12 elders, and according to the promise heretofore made, the Lord gave the following revelation, embracing the law of the church," which is where the section headings are getting that from. That is from the manuscript history of the church. So now let's get into Documents, Volume 1, the historical introduction to this section. We get this. We get a lot. It says, "Joseph Smith himself relocated to Ohio, and immediately after his arrival in Kirtland, the church received on 4th of February, 1831, the revelatory promise, 'By the prayer of your faith ye shall receive my law, that ye may know how to govern my church.' Less than a week later, on 9th of February, Joseph Smith dictated the revelation featured here during the course of a meeting of 12 elders who were called together and united in mighty prayer. John Whitmer titled it, 'The Laws of the Church of Christ.'" Further to this, there's a lot of copies of this out there, and that's kind of explained by the Joseph Smith Papers group. It says, outside of Revelation Book 1, there are few extant manuscript copies of most of Joseph Smith's early revelations. The 9th of February, 1831 revelation, however, is an exception. 5 early manuscript copies survive. This was one of the earliest revelations to be published. It was printed in part by 2 Ohio newspapers only a few months after its dictation. The most complete version of the revelation presented here is in the handwriting of early church member Sidmund's writer, and was possibly created on the 23rd of May, 1831. The date writer inscribed on the manuscript. This is likely the earliest of the 5 early surviving manuscript, although it is possible that the partial copy found in Revelation Book 1 was recorded first. So this is an example of, just from an editorial perspective, the earliest, most complete copy wins out, and that's why it's in Documents Volume 1. But there's a good chance that what we get in Revelation Book 1 is earlier, but it's just not complete. The question might arise if you've been, if you're super into this. So like the Articles and Covenants, for example, was a combination of several revelations, and it was a living document. So they were going around and changing things as it went, which was fine. So maybe a little less of a revelation, or I take that back, maybe a little less of an individual revelation and more of a group revelation, which is good. So do we get that here? It would make sense if we did. Is it an amalgamation of texts? So we get this from the historical introduction. Although it is unknown whether the initial writing captured the text as a single document, early manuscripts confirm that the individual answers were originally understood as separate commandments. For example, when John Whitmer copied what he titled the Church Law into Zebedee Coltrane's diary, he only included the second section. And in September of 1831, local newspapers published the first and second sections as the law. Further, although only the second of the 5 sections was titled the law in the early manuscripts, the composite document, including all 5 sections, also came to be known as the law. When the revelation was published in the Book of Commandments, it was introduced as a revelation given to 12 elders assembled in Kirtland, Ohio, and also the law for the government of the church given in the presence of the same. By describing the revelation in 2 parts, the heading suggests that the 2nd through 5th sections of the text were considered together as the law. It was considered a living text. It was open to some editorial changes, as we've seen before. So how many copies of this thing do we have? We were talking about all that we have to this point. So we have we have Sidmund's writer's document, Revelation Book 1, Revelation Book 2. We have the Book of Commandments. We have the Doctrine and Covenants. And it's also all over the place. It's found in John Whitmer's history. We've already talked about that. Of course, it's found in the manuscript history. It's also published in the Evening and Morning Star. It is published in Sydney, or not published, but it is written in Sidney Gilbert's journal. So there's a copy over there that we can read. Mormonism Unveiled, which was kind of an anti-Mormon book. It's published there. Zebedee Coltrane's diary, which for some reason is written in the handwriting of John Whitmer, also has a copy. Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith had a notebook that they shared, and this revelation shows up there. So there's a lot of early extant copies. So just to kind of give you truly what, how many of these that we have, where they are. And I would like to think that the church over the years, I don't know this for sure, in publishing this in modern times, maybe pulled from all these sources just to make sure they had it all. I don't know. But there's a lot of early copies to choose from. So very lucky that way. So the historical context for the rest of it. So this is verses 74 through 93. So 1 through 73 is in Revelation book 1. In a section of Revelation book 1. Then we get a scrap of paper. Then there's some stuff that's not quite working. Anyway, Simmons Writer has the entire thing. So there is a separate document in the Documents Volume 1 that talks about this, and it says, for its historical introduction, after this revelation was dictated, the law comprised 8 sections in all, 5 received on the 9th of February, and 3 on the 23rd of February. Of the earliest extant copies of the law, only the Simmons Writer copy, the version featured here, which is the rest of it, includes all 8 sections. It separates the 9 February revelation from the 23rd February revelation by including the date and the introductory heading between the 5th and 6th sections. The version found in Revelation Book 1 includes the first 5 sections, dictated 9th of February, as well as a loose leaf containing only the 8th section, or final paragraph, of the 23rd February dictation. Some later published versions also exclude the first 2 paragraphs of the 23rd of February revelation, possibly because those sections seems to summarize the content found in the first 5 sections. Textually, only the 8th and final paragraph in this document employs the divine first person, which is possibly the reason it was the only portion of the 23rd February revelation to be copied into Revelation Book 1, sort of speaking from the Lord's perspective, if you will. So I'm talking a lot about sections. You might get lost here. So what I have done is taken from the content of these revelations the 5 questions we're talking about and the answers that you get. I'm summarizing that for the sake of time. But again, this original revelation was done in a question and answer format. So getting into the content and some of the footnotes here, here's what you get. And this is how I'm going to go through it, just by questions. So this is the major change for the document. You don't read this in any published version. And so it's very special to what we have here. Now, not all the questions are in all the copies. So this is where we have to sort of gather everything together again. So the first question does not exist in the Writer copy. This thing we're touting as the original, most complete, does not have the first one. Revelation Book 1 does have it. It says, first, shall the church come together into one place or continue in separate establishments? In response to that, you get elders need to assemble together. You start getting called on missions 2 by 2. That's another thing, something the church still does to this day on missions. Build up the church until the New Jerusalem is revealed. So that's the answer that you get, and I'm summarizing those answers, obviously, for the sake of time. Second question you get, in the writer's copy, it says the law. In the Revelation Book 1, it says second, the law. I think they should have done that second E, but whatever. So then we have to go all the way over to Sidney Gilbert's version that he put in his journal, which says, question second, the law regulating the church in her present situation until the time of her gathering. Answer. And then you get the answer, which is, in summary, people must be ordained. They have to use the Articles and Covenants. And then we get into a list of 10 Commandments style literature to read here. It says, thou shalt not kill, steal, lie, lust, commit adultery, speak evil of thy neighbor. Those are all in there with accompanying punishments and things like that. Very Old Testament style language there. Then it talks about properties going to the bishop. And this is the first time we hear about something called the bishop's storehouse, which still exists today. So in every stake of the church, there is a bishop's storehouse. And this is where people who need help temporarily will go to get groceries and all sorts of stuff. I've actually served in bishop's storehouses before. There's also command to not be idle. And what I would term some training on how to serve in missionary duty. Like, what does that mean? Meaning you are sent forth to teach, not really to be taught, right? These are, you're going to teach out of the Bible and the Book of Mormon, like things like that. Very similar to what we train our missionaries to do today in the church. So that's the second question. Third question: how the elders are to dispose of their families while they are proclaiming repentance or are otherwise engaged in the service of the church. I personally don't like that language, dispose of my family. That seems negative, but I know what they mean. I know it's kind of a legal term, but anyway, I saw that and I was like, ugh. But anyway, in answer to that, you get questions about stewardships, standing in your stewardship. Family support comes from consecrated property. That's one of the reasons why they consecrated together. And all of that kind of works together. Now, I would argue that the current church version of this is what's called the General Missionary Fund, which is something that you can still donate to today. Or there are ward missionary funds. So if people are serving and money is an issue, we call upon church members to sort of rally behind them and help them out. So that's, again, the law is still used to this day. Fourth question: how far it is the will of the Lord that we should have dealings with the world, and how we should conduct our dealings with them. In response to this, you get, do not get into debt with the world except when it's necessary, and that any counsels about this should be directed by the Spirit. And this isolationism is very prevalent in early American society. There's a lot of religious groups that sort of separate themselves out. We've already talked about the family, part of the Campbellite religion, that did this. And then when the Saints moved to Utah, they were very insular. They did not want to, and they were preached very heavily against doing business with the outside world because they felt like it would diminish their positions. So there's that. All right. Then we get the fifth question: what preparations we shall make for our brethren from the east, and where and how? And basically it says, assist the bishop to obtain residences and gather close together. They wanted to be in close proximity to each other. And I would suspect that's one of the reasons why Joseph Smith and his family stayed as close into Kirtland as they could. So that was a lot. So those are the 5 questions, and that's what you don't get to see anymore. So that's kind of interesting. Again, all available on the Joseph Smith paper, so none of this is a secret, but you can go to the website and find it for yourself. Some notes from this revelation that we may have already discussed. Just wanted to make sure I cover all my bases here. So from the revelation, you get, thou shalt bear their infirmities, thou shalt stand in the place of thy stewardship, thou shalt not take thy brother's garment, thou shalt pay for that which thou shalt receive, and of thy brother. The footnote to this, footnote 24, says, John Whitmer, who visited the Morley family, this is the family we were talking about, wrote, quote, the disciples had all things common and were going to destruction very fast as to temporal things, for they considered from reading the scripture that what belonged to a brother belonged to any of the brethren. Therefore they would take each other's clothes and other property and use it without leave, which brought on confusion and disappointments, for they did not understand the scripture. So again, kind of repeating that, that Morley family ideal did not quite work out here. And so hence these questions and answers. That's kind of what it was all about. The 12 men that were there sort of discussed what this was, and they got answers to it through the law, section 42. A revelation also states that every family shall have places that they may live by themselves. And this is an interesting one. So footnote 33, this directive countered the communal living arrangements of the various family organizations. Some groups lived together on a single property, as was the case on Isaac Morley's farm in Kirtland. Others, such as the smaller group in Chardon, Ohio, reportedly shared a single house. One man has torn away all the partitions of the lower part of a good 2-story dwelling house. Here, a large number live together. So they're also kind of countering like, no, we should all be living in our own places, not just like crowded into one location. So, and communal living like that, even to this day, and it's 2025, people still do this. They'll live on a single property or maybe in a sort of a shared living space. So, what's the aftermath of this? Lots here. So, there's an interesting conclusion that is written in the historical introduction to section 42. It says, the text of this revelation, together with the church's founding articles and covenants, may have served to unify the Ohio and New York membership into a single community of believers by organizing them under the same laws and regulations. The New York members had been promised such a commandment as soon as they united with the Ohio members, and the questions asked at the 9 February meeting were followed by revelations that brought the two groups together under one law. Footnote 4 from this says, John Whitmer later recorded that after the above law or revelation was received, the elders went forth to proclaim repentance according to commandment, and there were numbers added to the church. John Corrill later wrote that he and his preaching companion, quote, went to New London, about 100 miles from Kirtland, where he built up a church of 36 members in about 3 weeks' time. Other elders proceeded to erect churches in various places, and the work increased very fast, unquote. So they went for it. They had their mission calls. They went forth 2 by 2. Again, the same pattern that we use today. Like I served a mission myself, and I constantly had companions. It was always 2 by 2. And then we get from footnote 13, and then we'll close it up. By May 1831, if not earlier, Bishop Edward Partridge appointed John Corrill and Isaac Morley as his assistants. They were formally ordained assistants to the bishop in a church conference on the 3rd of June, 1831. So I would call this, my personal opinion, amateur historian, that this is the first presiding bishopric of the church. And today, we still have this. There's a bishop and 2 counselors on a general level. And what's very interesting about this calling is that on a local level, on a ward level, you have a bishop and then there's 2 counselors. But on a general level, you have 3 bishops. They all have this call. And this is more than a calling. This is an office in the church. But even to this day, this is an office of the Aaronic priesthood. And therefore, you will hear people talking and referring to somebody by the title of bishop for the rest of their life, because you're never actually, once you receive an office, that's never really taken away from you. You're just maybe emeritus or not an actively serving bishop. This goes for patriarchs. This goes for bishops. This goes for president. Usually is not that. Elder is another. These are all titles that you hold and that people use to refer to you. So just kind of a footnote about bishops and this revelation and the one before it about bishops. So that was a very long set. I hope that was nice for you. So again, this is one of those really big revelations that covers a whole host of things. Tons of copies, lots of introductions to it. I hope I wasn't too much all over the place. There was just a lot of things to cover. In our next part, we're going to go after sections 43 and 44. And yeah, so stay tuned for that. And I hope this was helpful talking about the law. All right, chugging right along with our exploration of Doctrine and Covenants, sections 43 and 44 now. So the introduction that we get to section 43, we're back to our nice, comfortable pattern. It is the earliest copy is found in Revelation Book 1. It is called the 45th Commandment, and it is in the handwriting of John Whitmer. The scrap of paper that we were talking about in the previous part is adhered on this page. So. And it seems like when they adhered the scrap, it was like, okay, this is kind of, if you were reading the page, it's like the very end, and then the next one begins. And so what the photographer has done, I believe his name is Weldon Anderson, kind of peel it back, imposed it out, sort of cut it out of the photo, and that's what you get today. So that's a little paper adhering going on using some wax. Wow, I'm spending a lot of time on a scrap of paper. Anyway, it was awesome, and it's great. We've already talked about it. Anyway, it is also, we get some grammatical changes to the text here. Not a whole lot, but a few things here, which is good to see. It is chapter 45 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 14, in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. There are no changes to the section headings between 1981 and 2013. So glad to be back to a simple source note introduction. Anyway, circumstantially to this, Revelation Book 1 gives us an introduction here. It says, 45th Commandment, AD 1831, given to the elders of this church at Kirtland, Geauga, Ohio. John Whitmer's history gives us a little more. It says, about these days there was a woman by the name of Hubble who professed to be a prophetess of the Lord and professed to have many revelations and knew that the Book of Mormon was true and that she should become a teacher in the Church of Christ. She appeared very sanctimonious and deceived some who were not able to detect her in her hypocrisy. Others, however, had a spirit of discernment, and her follies and abominations were made manifest. The Lord gave revelation that the saints might not be deceived, which reads as follows. Now, I'm not so sure what she did that was so bad, but anyway, abominations seems to be a little harsh, John, but, we'll never talk about it anytime soon, I guess. The manuscript history gives us a little more as well. It says, soon after the foregoing revelation was received, so that's sections 42, a woman came with great pretensions to revealing commandments, laws, and other curious matters, and as every person almost has advocates for both theory and practice in the various notions and projects of the age, it became necessary to inquire of the Lord when I received the following. Just some of the flowery language of the 19th century, which is fun. Documents Volume 1, we get this from an historical introduction. It says, Joseph Smith dictated this revelation following his arrival in Kirtland, Ohio. It clarified Joseph Smith's position as the only person authorized to receive commandments and revelations for the Church of Christ. Before Joseph Smith's arrival in Kirtland, the converts in the area were left for several months without any experienced leadership. Now, this is what I think is a lot more understandable, I think. So you have Oliver Cowdery, and then the entire missionary force comes to Ohio, right? And they preach, and Sidney Rigdon and the Campbellites and the Morley family and the whole bit happens. But then they leave to keep traveling on their mission. And Sidney Rigdon, who is one of their leaders already, he leaves to go to see Joseph in New York. And then everybody comes back to Ohio. But there's a couple of months there where they didn't really have any experienced leadership. So they were doing the best that they could. Now, John Whitmer, again, I think is a little harsh here about, this woman, Sister Hubbard, or did I say that right? No, Hubbard. Mother Hubbard. Hubble. Sorry, Hubble. But also, the people just like taking things from each other, thinking it's the law of consecration, but it's really just kind of like this chaos. So I think there's a lot of I think it's understandable that they would be that way. And also, again, this is the 19th century. It's not like everybody went to high school and everybody went to college. Like, you're out on the frontier, and this is the best life you have. So all things considered, I think they actually kept it together pretty well. Again, amateur historian, what do I know? But this is a little bit of a context of the status of things when they got there. So John Whitmer, again, did not like what he saw when he first got to Kirtland. So we get this historical introduction. When Whitmer arrived in mid-January, the conduct of the Ohio members surprised and concerned him. He wrote, the enemy of all righteousness had made them think that an angel of God appeared to them and showed them writings on the outside cover of the Bible and on parchment, which flew through the air and on the back of their hands, and many such foolish and vain things. Others lost their strength, and some slid on the floor, and such like maneuvers, which proved greatly to the injury of the cause. Whitmer concluded that it was necessary that this people should have instruction and learn to discern between things of God and the works of Satan. So he was not a fan of what he found. Now, what has already been mentioned, and if you're at all familiar with some of the previous sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, this is the second time that Joseph Smith is kind of formally challenged as being the one who gets to have revelations for the church. Previously, we had Hiram Page, who had a dark stone that he received revelations from. and people thought it was legit. And why wouldn't they? I mean, this is all brand new, and Joseph's talking about having his own seer stones. And then they agreed as a group and received a revelation that sort of sorted it out. Hiram Smith went along with it, and it was kind of an idyllic way of solving your problems, like talking and listening and, praying about it and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. So this is the second time we get Sister. I keep wanting to call her Hubble. I want to call her Hubbard, or fairy tales coming back to my mind, or nursery rhymes rather. Anyway, so now you get this again, and so again, I think this makes a lot of sense. Like, this is all new. The church hasn't even been organized for a year yet. Like, a lot of this is new, and so what I like about it is it seems like the members and even Joseph Smith himself is like, you got a point. Let's pray about it. Let's get a revelation. Let's see what it says. It seems to me like that's the sort of the general feel of this. But it's kind of nice that people are willing to sort of talk and maybe even debate about these things. So the challenge to his authority says, from the historical introduction, in this atmosphere of religious excess came a specific challenge to Joseph Smith's authority. In February of 1831, the same month that Joseph Smith and other members arrived from New York, a woman referred to as Mrs. Hubble claimed to receive revelations, which she shared publicly with other members. Again, very reminiscent of Hiram Page and his stone. Footnote 5 to this says, critic Ezra Booth reported that Hubble so integrated herself into the esteem and favor of some of the elders that they received her as a person commissioned to act a conspicuous part in the Mormonizing the world. Booth added, Rigdon and some others gave her the right hand of fellowship and literally saluted her with what they called the kiss of charity. But Smith, viewing her as encroaching upon his sacred premises, declared her an impostor, and she returned to the place from whence she came. Man, I wish we could talk like that again. The place from whence she came. So Ezra Booth is not necessarily a fan of the church, obviously. But that is apparently what happened, is that Joseph showed up and said, no, this doesn't feel right. Our manuscript history goes a little further. It says, similarly, the introduction to this revelation in Joseph Smith's history notes that, quote, a woman came with great pretensions to revealing commandments, laws, and other curious matters, and that Joseph Smith felt it was, quote, necessary to inquire of the Lord. So let's get into a little bit of the footnotes of this. Mostly what we get from the Joseph Smith papers from this is just scriptural references. So that's really it. Not a whole lot of extra stuff here. And apparently Mrs. Hubbard returned to the place from whence she came. She kind of, like, that revelation was received. People sort of got together and talked about it, and she skipped town, I guess. So not a whole lot of extra stuff here for 43, but that's as much filling in the history as I can give you from the Joseph Smith papers. So let's move on to section 44. And this earliest copy is also found in Revelation Book 1. This is a lot shorter of a revelation than we've had before. It is called the 46th Commandment. Some changes in the text were made by the hand of Sidney Rigdon. So you get the grammatical changes, but then you also have a few phrases that you currently will read in the scriptures, which is, the additions are, quote, inasmuch as they are faithful and exercise faith in me, unquote. Written in the hand of Sidney Rigdon, made it into the publication. Next one, quote, not have power over you that you may be preserved in all, etc. and so forth. So that's the second quote. So those are the changes from the original that we get some kind of highlights there from Sidney Rigdon. And so you can kind of see that Sidney was a big part of making sure that revelations were maybe filled out, and I'm sure it was done in a committee. I mean, you had John Whitmer there, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith was a part of some of this, John Whitmer. There's a lot of people involved there. So, chapter 46 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 62 in the Doctrine and Covenants. There are no changes in section headings in the modern scripture, so no differences besides the removal of a reference to the history of the church, pretty much the same language between 1981 and 2013. So let's get into some circumstances surrounding this. Revelation Book 1 states, 46th Commandment, February 1831. A revelation to Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, received at Kirtland, Ohio, a call to the elders of this church, etc. Not much in contemporary publications. Things like, Revelation given February 1831. That's about all you get from the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835. John Whitmer's history, coming right out of section 43, Revelation, says, after this commandment, section 43, was received, the saints came to understanding on this subject, and unity and harmony prevailed throughout the church of God. And the saints began to learn wisdom and treasure up knowledge which they learned from the word of God, and by experience as they advanced in the way of eternal life. And Joseph Smith Jr., the seer, continued the translation of the Holy Scriptures, and the word of the Lord came to Joseph Smith Jr., saying, and then you get section 44. The manuscript history fills out a little further here. It says, the latter part of February, I received the following revelation, which caused the church to appoint a conference to be held on the 6th of June ensuing. It was given at Kirtland, February 1831, to Joseph Smith Jr. and Sidney Rigdon, which is how it's described in a lot of contemporary and modern scripture. Historical introduction from Documents, Volume 1. Joseph Smith implied a date prior to this 22nd February when he apparently alluded to this revelation in a letter to Martin Harris, whom he instructed to, quote, inform the elders which are there that all of them who can be spared will come here without delay if possible by this commandment of the Lord, unquote. So that's why it's placed chronologically, is because right after this revelation was received, you get sort of this letter saying, okay, elders, we need you to come back to do this conference, right? You can see that from the history of the church. And that's about kind of all we get to sort of fill in like where this is placed in the history as we have it. There is a letter, that letter that I just referred to is here, and it's printed in between this revelation and the rest of section 42 that we get, kind of that ending part that we get from Sidman Ryder's journals. Sidman Ryder's journal. That's hard to say. Anyway. It's a letter to Martin Harris. This is what it looks like. Urging him to come to Ohio. As you may remember, Martin Harris was a major landowner in New York State and helped publish the Book of Mormon, helped lose a few pages, all those things, and he is sort of urged to come. So that's where we are in the history here. So again, the references there helped the historians on the Joseph Smith papers order these properly. So that's what you get. And that's a letter to Martin Harris, very short letter. So a little bit in the content and footnotes here. We have a passage that states, many shall be converted insomuch that ye shall obtain power to organize yourselves according to the laws of man. Footnote 2, very interesting footnote here for me. Ohio's 1819 Act for the Incorporation of Religious Societies required that, quote, not less than 20 members, unquote, meet to elect officers and that they have their new organization legally recorded by the county clerk. Once a religious society became a body corporate in law, it could hold in fee simple any tract or tracts of land on which to erect such buildings as may be necessary for their religious worship. No evidence has been found that the church complied with this law. This is according to our footnote in the Joseph Smith papers. So we apparently never really did that. Now, if you know, later on, we did build a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. A house of the Lord, I should say, in Kirtland, Ohio is how they refer to it. So, yeah, we'll get to that later on, I suppose. I don't know if that's going to be a big deal, but yeah, that's what they did. That was their religious building. But apparently they did not comply with the law from 1819. So, yeah, thought that was kind of interesting. The revelation here also mentions that they are to obey the law that they received, which is now section 42. And footnote 5, based on that, says, part of the recently revealed law of the church called for the donation and redistribution or consecration of members' property so that every man may receive according as he stands in need. So that is coming from section 42, filling that out a little bit. So what's the aftermath of this? Well, the historical introduction gives us this. There is some uncertainty as to when the proposed meeting of the elders, the day that they assembled themselves together, occurred. Minute Book 2 records a special meeting of the elders of the Church of Christ held at Kirtland, Geauga County, Ohio, April 9th, 1831, to do church business, etc. But little else is said about the content of that meeting. However, Joseph Smith's history explains that this revelation caused the church to appoint a conference to be held on the 6th of June ensuing. The records relating to the June 1831 conference include an extensive list of elders as well as accounts of ordinations to the high priesthood. The June conference, rather than the 9th of April meeting, is therefore more likely the meeting to which the elders were called to gather. And there you have it. So, as I see it, these sections, this little block that we have, is, hey, we did the thing. We all came to Ohio. And if you combine your faith, you're going to receive the law. And then we have two sort of aftermaths of not only the law received, but also everybody suddenly showing up in Ohio. And this, I may say, is the beginning of something I find very interesting about a religion, any religion, but the Latter-day Saints being one religion, that is based on convert baptisms. Everyone in the church, Joseph Smith, for heaven's sake, Samuel Smith, the first actual baptism in the church that we know, everybody's got to join. And they come with their ideas. We have people who used to be Catholics and Jews, and in this case, Campbellites, Morley family. Maybe you were a Shaker. And you're going to bring these various things with you. And what I really love about the early church approach to these things is to say, I don't know, like let's ask, let's get together. We'll have a conference. We'll talk about it. In the case of section 42, this law that was received, very odd that you would have a law received that was based on 5 questions of how do we do these various things, or what do you want us to do? And then you get a response to it. There's a couple of other sections in the Doctrine and Covenants that follow this call response idea, this sort of question and answer, and we'll get to those later on. But I thought it was just really interesting, a very generous religion in terms of talking about what our problems are and how we're going to solve them. So that is it for our episode this week. Kind of long. Like I said, 42 is just, it's what it is. It was a highly anticipated revelation. You received it, lots of stuff about it. So hopefully that wasn't too much. But again, the point of the exercise here from the amateur historian is to fill in the history. So until next week, hope you have a great one. And solve your problems. Talk and listen. It works. It works way back to the 19th century. So have a good week, and we'll see you next week.